Under the burning sun of the northern desert, the air was heavy with the kind of silence that follows violence. The sand shimmered like molten glass, and the wind whispered secrets through the dry brush. 5 Apache warriors hung from a wooden beam stretched between 2 stone posts, their shadows long and still on the dust below. The smell of sweat, iron, and old blood clung to the wind. Just beyond them stood a woman, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly, her face pale but steady. She didn't cry, she didn't pray. She only watched the men sway slightly in the wind as if waiting for something older than justice, deeper than revenge. No one knew her name in that barren stretch of land. The settlers at the fort called her the Quiet One. Some said she'd been a nurse once. Others whispered she was a deserter's wife, carrying his child and his sins. But the truth was more complicated than any rumor. She had come to that desert to disappear, but the desert had a cruel way of uncovering what people tried to bury. The Apaches had been captured 3 days before by a patrol from the northern post soldiers who'd lost friends in raids and wanted a hanging more than a trial. The commanding officer said it was justice. The scouts said it was necessary. But when the nooses tightened around those men's necks, something inside her broke not in pity, but in recognition. She saw their eyes before the bags covered them. They were not begging for life. They were staring at her. One of them, the tallest, had looked straight into her soul as if he already knew what she would do. That night, as the guards drank and the desert turned cold, she walked out from the cabin where they kept her. The moonlight spilled across the sand, silver and cruel. The wind carried the sound of wolves crying far away. Her heart pounded, not just with fear, but with something fierce and unstoppable. Every step she took toward those hanged men was a step away from the life she'd been told to live, a step toward something darker, more alive. When she reached them, the bodies hung still, but their eyes opened. One by one. It wasn't possible, but she didn't question it. The ropes creaked softly. Their breath was faint, like the whisper of dying embers. She could feel the desert watching her, the mountains silent witnesses to what was about to happen. Her knife, small and sharp, trembled in her hand. She hesitated. A voice inside her said she was crossing a line that could never be undone. But another voice older, stronger, said it had already been decided. You can't save them, the wind seemed to hiss. Shh. But she wasn't saving anyone. Shh. She was setting something free. The first rope snapped under her blade with a low twang, then another, then another. With every cut, her heartbeat grew louder, her breath shorter, her eyes wet with sweat, and something like fear but not quite. By the time the 5th man fell into the sand, the moon disappeared behind a cloud. The silence that followed was heavier than death. The men lay still for a long time before the first one gasped, dragging air into his chest. His eyes opened, and in them burned a light she had never seen before, something not quite human. He stood, taller than any man she'd ever known. His skin marked with dirt, blood, and faint blue lines that shimmered beneath the moonlight. His hair was long and black, bound with feathers, his body carved by battle and suffering. The others rose behind him like shadows given flesh. She stepped back, her knife slipping from her fingers. None of them spoke. But the air around them changed. The cold wind turned hot, and the sand shifted as if alive. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did I do it?" The tall warrior's gaze fell on her belly, then back to her eyes. He said something in a language she didn't understand, but she felt the meaning deep inside her bones. It was a promise and a curse. Somewhere far to the north, thunder rumbled, though no storm cloud marked the sky. The mountains seemed to answer him, echoing the sound like the growl of a waking beast. By dawn, the gallows stood empty. The soldiers found the cut rope swinging and the footprints leading toward the mountains. The woman was gone too. Only her old bonnet lay in the sand, caught on a thorn bush. The commander spat and cursed, ordering search parties, but the desert swallowed their tracks faster than they could follow. Men whispered about witchcraft, about Apache spirits, and the vengeance of the north wind. They said she had made a deal with something not of this world. Weeks passed before the first stories began to spread about outposts burned to the ground, about soldiers found with their rifles melted in their hands and their eyes wide open, as if they'd seen the devil himself. Cattle ranches abandoned, supply trains missing, settlers vanishing on the road to Santa Fe, and always, somewhere in the distance, riders said they saw a figure walking through the smoke, a woman with a rounded belly, her eyes dark as obsidian, followed by 5 silent shadows that moved like ghosts through the sand. The desert was changing. The animals grew restless. Even the Apaches in the mountains refused to travel at night. They spoke of the spirit woman, the one who freed the condemned and woke the vengeance that had slept for generations. They said she carried the blood of both the oppressor and the oppressed, that her unborn child would be the bridge or the breaking between 2 worlds. Some called her cursed, others chosen. But far from campfires and stories, the truth was walking across the desert. Her feet blistered, her heart torn between fear and purpose. The tall warrior, his wounds still red, his strength growing each day, walked beside her. He didn't thank her, didn't speak of debt or gratitude. Yet when the desert wind rose, he stood in front of her, shielding her from the grit and heat. Sometimes, when the night grew quiet, she caught him watching her with eyes that saw more than her face, as if he could see through the skin to the pulse of the life she carried. "What are you?" she asked once. He didn't answer. Somewhere in the distance, lightning cracked across a cloudless sky. As the sun rose, painting the mountains gold, they came to the edge of a canyon that seemed to split the earth in 2. He stopped there, looking north, his jaw tight, his muscles coiled like something waiting to strike. The others formed a line behind him. For the first time, she noticed the scars across their backs, marks of whips, burns, and shackles. They weren't just men. They were symbols of every cruelty this land had ever buried under its dust. And now, freed by her trembling hands, they had returned to balance the scales. She felt her child stir within her, a small, sharp movement that sent fear crawling up her spine. The wind carried the smell of rain, though no clouds hung above them. The warrior turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You set us free," he said at last, his voice low, like thunder under the earth. "Now nothing can stop what's coming." Her breath caught. "What's coming?" He looked toward the north, where the horizon burned red in the early light. "The devil," he said, "and you called him home." The ground trembled beneath her feet. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote howled. She clutched her belly, feeling the heartbeat inside, her fast, wild, and strong.
Ow!
The air grew heavy, the world holding its breath. In that moment, she realized what she had unleashed wasn't just vengeance. It was destiny. And it was already coming for them all. The woman stood at the edge of the canyon, the rising sun painting the desert floor in shades of fire and dust. Her breath came slow, steady, her hand resting over the small life that moved within her. The tall Apache warrior still faced north, silent as the rock beneath his feet.
Alt?
The other 4 stood a few paces behind, their shadows long and sharp. It was as though words belonged to another world, one they'd left hanging on that wooden beam with the broken ropes. She didn't know where he planned to go, only that she was meant to follow. Every step since that night had felt like a choice made long before she was born, a path laid out by something older than the world she knew. When the warrior finally turned, his eyes caught the sunlight. For a heartbeat, she saw something in them, a storm, a memory, maybe both. He motioned for her to follow, and they began walking into the valley below. The canyon swallowed them whole. Its walls were steep, painted in red and gold like old blood and rusted iron. The wind whistled through narrow cuts in the rock, carrying the faint cry of a hawk somewhere far above. She could feel the weight of the desert pressing in, not cruelly, but as if it were testing her, measuring what kind of spirit she carried. Every few miles she stumbled, and every time one of the men reached for her arm to steady her.
Ow.
None of them smiled or spoke, yet their silence carried its own kind of strength. When they finally stopped, the sun had climbed high overhead. The tall warrior stood at the mouth of a cave carved into the canyon wall. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of smoke and sage. She hesitated before stepping in. Something about the place felt alive. The walls were covered in markings, handprints, symbols, animal shapes, and spirals that seemed to move when the firelight flickered. "These are old," she said softly. He nodded once, older than memory. She looked at him carefully. "You were dead. Saw you hang." He didn't flinch. "We were taken from life, but not from the earth." She didn't understand what that meant, but the tone in his voice made her stay silent. He motioned for her to sit, then took a pouch from his belt and poured water into a small clay bowl. The others formed a circle, their faces lit by the soft orange glow of a fire built from desert brush. When he began to speak, it was in his native tongue, deep, rhythmic, and filled with the rise and fall of something sacred. The sound filled the cave like wind through old trees. When he finished, he looked at her again. He called him the devil from the north, but he was no devil. He was a man who carried fire in his hands and thunder in his chest. He came long before your people crossed these plains. He brought death, not for conquest, but for vengeance. The earth remembers him still. When you cut those ropes, you called his spirit back. Her stomach tightened. How could I call something I didn't believe in? You believed in justice, he said. That was enough. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain from the distant mountains. She looked around the cave again, tracing the carvings with her eyes. In the flickering light, she thought she saw movement as shadows slipping across the wall, separate from the fire's dance. You said nothing can stop what's coming, she whispered. What did you mean? The warrior's expression darkened. When blood is shed unjustly, the land keeps count. When the balance is broken, it seeks to heal itself. You freed us, but the land does not know mercy. It will take back what it is owed. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly. And what does it want? He looked away, as though the question itself carried weight. That, he said quietly, depends on who you truly are. That night, the wind rose again, howling through the canyon like a morning song. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the men she had freed hanging, still, the ropes cutting deep into their necks. But behind those images came something else, a shape moving through the desert, dark and enormous, its eyes glowing like embers. It was not man or beast, but something between the two. When it turned its gaze toward her, she woke gasping. The tall warrior sat nearby, sharpening a blade made from black stone. Saw him, he said without looking up. She swallowed hard. What was it? The memory of what's coming? For days they traveled north, deeper into lands untouched by wagon trails or army boots. The canyons gave way to open plains, then to the dark forests that bordered the high country. Sometimes they passed the ruins of old settlements, burned cabins, collapsed barns, wagons half buried in sand. Once they found a skeleton wearing a soldier's jacket, half eaten by time. The warrior took nothing from it, only covered it with stones, and said a few words under his breath. At night, she listened to their quiet voices around the fire. They spoke of old battles, of tribes scattered and lost, of the way the earth used to sing when the rains came. She realized they were not merely men. They were remnants of something older than history, bound to the desert by pain, now freed by her hands. And yet, she couldn't tell if what she had done was mercy or a mistake. One evening, as dusk bled across the sky, they reached a ridge overlooking the northern valley. Smoke curled from the distance, faint but unmistakable. The warrior's eyes narrowed. Fort Ridge, he said, the place where we died. Her throat tightened. You're going back? He nodded. To finish what was started, but there are soldiers there. Dozens. They won't be enough. The certainty in his tone chilled her more than the cold wind. She tried to speak again, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't anger, it was inevitability. The same force that had driven her to the gallows that night was burning in him now. Later, while the others slept, she sat alone by the fire. The stars hung heavy overhead, and the flames threw her shadow long against the rocks. She felt the child move again, stronger this time, as if reacting to the air around them. Her thoughts drifted back to the day she'd arrived at the outpost, the heat. The fear, the way the soldiers had looked at her when they learned she was carrying a child. She had come to the frontier to start over, to escape the war-torn towns back east. But fate had brought her here, to this place between heaven and hell. She remembered the officer who'd ordered the hanging's cold eyes, smooth words, a man who spoke of law while standing knee-deep in cruelty. He'd laughed when she pleaded for mercy. They don't understand mercy, he'd said. They only understand the rope. Now she wondered who really didn't understand. The next morning, as the sun rose, she saw the tall warrior standing alone on the ridge. The wind tugged at his hair, and the light turned the faint blue markings on his skin to gold. She joined him, her steps slow but steady. "You don't have to follow me," he said without turning. "I can't go back," she answered. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Then walk with us until the end." "What if I can't bear what comes next?" "You already have." They started down the ridge toward the valley, where the fort's wooden walls rose faintly against the horizon. Smoke from its chimneys, mixed with the morning mist, and faint echoes of gunfire carried through the still air. The earth trembled again, subtle but real, as if something beneath it was stirring. She didn't know what waited for them beyond that ridge: revenge, redemption, or ruin, but as she looked north, she felt it rising like a tide. Whatever vengeance she had unleashed that night was no longer in her hands. It was in the hands of the earth itself, and as the wind grew colder, she knew the devil from the north was no longer just a story whispered in fear. He was coming. The march toward Fort Ridge began at dawn, a slow and steady procession across the hard northern plain. The woman walked behind the Apache warriors, her hands resting over the life she carried, her eyes tracing the dust that rose with each step. The sky above them burned pale gold, but the air held a chill that didn't belong to morning. Every mile northward felt heavier, like the land itself was warning them to turn back. But none of them did. The tall warrior led the way, silent and unyielding. His body carried the strength of a man reborn, though the wounds around his neck and wrists still looked raw. His presence alone commanded the air of movement, controlled, deliberate, almost ritual. Behind him, the others followed with the discipline of ghosts, bound to a single purpose. Didn't speak, didn't look around. Their eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, where smoke and ruin waited. By midday, the woman's strength began to falter. The heat pressed down, and her lips cracked from thirst. One of the warriors, the youngest, broke away from the group and offered her a pouch of water. She met his eyes for the first time. There was no malice there, only a quiet understanding, as if he too carried a burden he couldn't put down. She drank, nodding her thanks, and they continued on in silence. That night, they camped beneath a cluster of jagged rocks overlooking the valley. The woman sat by the small fire, while the men prepared their weapons bows, strung with sinew, knives carved from stone, tomahawks bound with rawhide. She realized they had no firearms, yet their confidence never wavered. When she asked the tall warrior why they didn't carry rifles like the soldiers, he looked at her with eyes that reflected the firelight like polished obsidian. "Guns belong to those who fear distance," he said. "We bring vengeance with our hands." She looked away, the meaning sinking deeper than the words themselves. The flames crackled, and in the distance, the cry of a coyote echoed through the valley. The night grew colder. She felt her child move again, restless under her skin. The warrior noticed, but said nothing. As the fire burned low, she found herself thinking about the man she had once called husband. He'd been stationed at Fort Ridge, man of ambition and charm, who believed the desert could be tamed with fences and rifles. He had written letters filled with promises, but when she arrived months later, she found only the hard face of command and the smell of fear. He wasn't the man she'd married anymore. Something about the frontier had stripped him bare. He had been there the day the Apaches were captured. She remembered his hand gripping her arm as she begged him to stop the hanging. "You don't understand these people," he had said. "Mercy makes us weak." She never forgave him for those words. But now, as the wind whispered across the rocks, she wondered what he would think if he saw her walking beside the very men he'd condemned. The next morning, they reached the ridge overlooking the fort. The sight stole her breath. Fort Ridge stood like a scar on the land, a wall of timber and smoke, surrounded by trenches and cannon wagons. Soldiers moved in steady rhythm, unaware of the eyes watching from above. The flag snapped in the wind, bright and bold against the pale sky. To anyone else, it might have looked like order. To her, it looked like arrogance. The tall warrior crouched beside her. "Your people have forgotten what the land means," he said quietly. "They build walls where the wind should move free. They spill blood and call it law. They'll kill you if you go down there," she whispered. He turned his gaze toward the fort, his expression unreadable. They already did. Below, a group of soldiers rode out on patrol, their laughter carrying faintly through the air. One of them stopped to drink from a canteen, glancing toward the canyon as if sensing something unseen. The warrior's hand twitched, his jaw tightening. But he didn't move, not yet. They waited until dusk. The fort's lanterns flickered to life, one by one, casting small halos of light across the yard. Smoke from the cook fires curled into the dimming sky. The woman's heart beat faster with every passing minute. She didn't know what the warriors planned, only that something was about to break. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. As the last light faded, the tall warrior rose. He said something low in his native tongue, and the others responded with a single nod. Then they vanished into the shadows, moving down the ridge like part of the night itself. She wanted to call out to stop them, but her voice refused to rise. All she could do was watch as the darkness swallowed them whole. Hours passed. The only sound was the wind and the distant hum of crickets. Then, faintly, she heard a low rumble, like thunder rolling underground. The horses in the fort began to whinny, restless. The guards shouted, confused. And then came the sound of fire sharp, sudden, alive. A tower of light burst upward as the powder stores ignited. The ground beneath her shook, and she fell to her knees, clutching her belly. From the ridge, she saw figures moving through the chaos, 5 of them, cutting through the fort like shadows on a battlefield. The soldiers fired wildly, but the shots seemed to vanish into the dark. For every flash of gunfire, another scream rose from below. She pressed her hands over her ears, tears stinging her eyes. This wasn't justice. It was something deeper, something ancient and unstoppable. When dawn came, smoke covered the valley. The fort was gone, its walls reduced to splinters, the flag torn and blackened. She descended slowly, stepping over the remains of what had been order and command. Bodies lay half buried in ash, their faces still twisted in shock. The air was thick with the smell of burned wood and powder. The tall warrior stood among the ruins, his chest rising and falling with slow, even breaths. The others were silent around him, their eyes turned north again. She approached carefully, her voice trembling. "You did this?" He didn't deny it. He only gave back what was taken. "Then it's done," she said. "You can stop now." He looked at her with something like sorrow. "It's never done. You can't stop a river once the dam is broken." She shook her head. "But this is vengeance, not justice." He stepped closer, his eyes burning like coals. "The land doesn't care what you call it. It remembers blood." She turned away, her throat tight, her heart aching for the dead and for the living. Behind them, the sun broke over the mountains, red and gold, lighting the smoke like a crown of fire. In that light, she saw the truth of what she had unleashed. It wasn't just revenge, it was reckoning. That night, they made camp near the ruins. The woman couldn't sleep. Her dreams were filled with fire and cries, with the image of the tall warrior standing against the flames like a god of war. When she woke, the desert was silent again. Ow. The men sat in a circle, speaking softly in their language. She didn't need to understand the words to know what they meant. The vengeance of the devil from the north had only begun. Soldiers at Fort Ridge were not the last to answer for the blood that had been spilled. The woman felt her child move again, stronger than before. Somewhere deep inside, she wondered if the life she carried was part of the same storm born from death, meant to change the world or destroy it. As the sun rose, painting the desert in gold, she looked north once more. Far beyond the horizon, she could feel the pull of something vast and unstoppable. Whatever they had awakened that night was no longer theirs to command. It belonged to the earth, to the spirits, to the storm rising from the north. And it was coming for everything built on stolen land. The wind turned colder as they moved north, crossing the blackened ruins of Fort Ridge. The woman walked beside the tall warrior in silence, her steps slow, her body aching from both the journey and the child growing inside her. Then smoke still drifted from what remained of the fort, twisting through the dawn light like spirits rising toward the heavens. Behind them, the other 4 warriors followed, their faces marked by soot and exhaustion, yet their eyes burned with something fierce of fire that no victory could cool. They did not speak of what happened at the fort. There were no words for it. The earth had drunk too much blood for speech. Yet even in silence, the woman felt the pull between them, a land invisible bond born from that night at the gallows. She had freed them, but it no longer felt like an act of mercy. It felt like a summons, and every step forward carried her deeper into a path she no longer understood. By midday, they reached a stretch of land where the sand turned to dry grass. The mountains loomed higher ahead, sharp against the horizon, and the sky grew darker with clouds that shouldn't have been there. Thunder rolled from the north, low and distant, like something breathing beneath the ground. The tall warrior stopped and looked toward it, his jaw tightening. "It begins," he said quietly. She frowned. "What begins?" "The storm that was promised." The others exchanged glances, their faces drawn and solemn. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Every instinct told her to turn back, to run from whatever lay ahead, but there was no turning back anymore. The desert had taken that choice from her the night she cut the ropes. They made camp beneath an old cottonwood tree that had somehow survived the drought. The woman sat by the small fire, watching the flames dance in the wind, while the tall warrior traced symbols into the dirt with the tip of his knife. They were the same markings she had seen in the cave, the spirals and shapes that seemed to move when the light shifted. "What do they mean?" she asked softly. He looked up. "They are the memory of what once was. Before your people came, before the wars. The land had balance then. But when blood was spilled on sacred soil, something ancient woke." "Is that what you call the devil from the north?" He nodded slowly. "He is not a man, not anymore. He is the spirit of the land's fury, the storm that cleanses. He waits in the mountains until the world forgets its mercy. And then he rises." Her heart pounded. "And you're bringing him back?" His gaze was steady, but there was pain behind it. "He is already awake. You only cut the ropes that bound him." The words sent a shiver through her. She looked at the fire again, trying to find comfort in its warmth, but the flames flickered weakly, as though afraid to burn too bright. The sky above had turned gray, and a low hum seemed to move through the air, a vibration that made her skin prickle. That night, she dreamed of the gallows again. But this time, she was the one hanging there, her hands bound, her breath slipping away. The 5 warriors stood beneath her, their faces turned upward, their eyes black as night. Then a flash of lightning tore the sky apart, and she saw the shape of something massive behind them, a figure made of smoke and storm, its eyes glowing with cold fire. When she woke, her body was shaking, and the wind outside roared like a living thing. The tall warrior was already awake, standing at the edge of camp, his hair whipping in the wind. She walked toward him, wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders. "The storm," she said, "is coming closer." He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the horizon where the clouds churned like black water. Then faintly she heard something beneath the thunder, the sound of hoofbeats. Many of them. She turned sharply. Riders. The others stood, gripping their weapons. In moments the sound grew louder, clearer, the unmistakable rhythm of horses driven hard. Soon she saw them, a column of riders cutting through the plain, their rifles glinting in the dying light. The soldiers had returned. "They're hunting us," she whispered. The tall warrior didn't move. "Let them come." The ground trembled as the riders drew closer, their voices rising in shouts and curses. The woman's pulse raced. She grabbed the warrior's arm. "You can't fight them all." He turned to her, calm as stone. "This is not a fight. It is a reckoning." Before she could speak again, he raised his hand, and the others moved like a single shadow. They spread across the ridge, taking positions with quiet precision. The woman crouched behind the rocks, clutching her belly, the air thick with the scent of rain and dust. The first shots rang out. The soldiers fired wildly into the hills, the sound echoing across the valley. The warriors didn't move. They waited, invisible in the dusk. Then, like a sudden gust, they struck. Arrows cut through the air, hitting their marks before the soldiers even saw where they came from. Horses reared, men shouted, and chaos swallowed the plain. The woman couldn't see everything, but she could hear it, the screams, the clash of steel, the thunder rolling above them. Lightning split the sky, striking the ground so close that the earth shook beneath her knees. The storm had arrived. Through the smoke and dust, she saw him, the tall warrior, standing against the lightning, his figure outlined by fire. He moved with a kind of fury that looked almost divine, each strike precise, its motion carrying the weight of something more than human strength. The other warriors fought beside him, silent and deadly, their movements a blur of purpose and vengeance. But the soldiers kept coming. There were too many of them. Gunfire cracked through the storm, and she saw one of the warriors fall, his body crumpling into the mud. The tall one turned, his roar echoing through the valley like thunder itself. The ground seemed to respond, shaking violently, splitting open near the ridge. Horses screamed and stumbled as the soil gave way beneath them. The woman tried to stand, but pain shot through her abdomen. The child inside her twisted, sharp and urgent. She gasped, falling to her knees. The storm roared around her, the world spinning with wind and fire. She could hear the warrior shouting something, but his voice was lost in the thunder. Then came the sound that froze her blood, the unmistakable whistle of a bullet, followed by a heavy thud. She turned, her heart in her throat. The tall warrior staggered, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. For a moment he stayed standing, his eyes burning bright even as the rain began to fall. Then he dropped to one knee, his hand pressed to the wound. "Oh," she whispered, crawling toward him. The ground trembled harder. Clouds above swirled in a perfect circle, lightning flashing within their depths. The rain turned to hail, pelting the earth like shattered glass. The soldiers began to retreat, shouting in panic as their horses bolted. But the storm wouldn't let them go. It chased them, the wind screaming, the earth splitting open beneath their hooves. She reached the warrior's side. His breath came slow, ragged. He looked at her with the faintest smile. "You see now?" he said softly. "The land remembers." Tears mixed with the rain on her face. "Can't die. Not now." He touched her hand, his palm still warm. "Death is not the end. It is the beginning of truth." The sky flashed again. For an instant, she saw a shape forming within the storm, a colossal figure of wind and flame. Eyes glowing white against the darkness. The devil from the north. It moved toward them, step by step, shaking the earth with its presence. She clutched the warrior's hand tighter. The other surviving warriors had gathered around, their faces pale with awe. None of them spoke. They all felt at the pull, the power, the end of everything they knew. The woman looked at the storm, and then at the child she carried. Somewhere deep inside, she knew what the spirit wanted. It wasn't just vengeance, it was balance. And balance demanded blood. As the storm drew closer, its roar filled the valley until nothing else could be heard. The air turned white with lightning, the ground alive beneath her feet. The woman rose slowly, her hair whipping in the wind, her eyes fixed on the heart of the storm. The tall warrior's voice reached her one last time, faint but certain. "It comes for all who have taken from the land," he said. "But you are the bridge. Only you can decide what the world becomes when the storm passes." The wind swallowed his words, and lightning tore through the sky again, brighter than ever. The woman took a step forward, her face pale but unflinching. As the devil from the north descended upon them, the wind howled with the fury of 1,000 storms, tearing across the valley until the land itself seemed to tremble beneath its power. The woman stood at the heart of it all, her hair whipped wild, her eyes locked on the towering figure rising from the clouds. The devil from the north had come no longer a tale whispered around campfires, but a living storm, its eyes burning white, its voice the sound of thunder tearing open the sky. The surviving warriors knelt, their heads bowed in silence, as if recognizing something older than life itself. The woman clutched her belly, feeling the heartbeat of the child inside her pounding as hard as her own. She could feel the pull of the storm calling to her, tugging at her spirit, demanding something she couldn't yet name. The tall warrior lay near her, his breathing shallow, blood mixing with the rain-soaked dirt. His gaze, even through the haze of pain, was clear and steady. "It knows you," he said weakly. "You carry what it seeks." She fell to her knees beside him, gripping his hand. "Tell me what it wants." "The land needs balance," he said. "Your people took too much. Our people bled too long. Now the storm asks who will pay the final debt." His voice broke as another wave of thunder rolled across the canyon. "But if it takes you, the child will never know peace." Her tears mixed with the rain. "Then what do I do?" He looked at her with something like pride. "You decide." The storm's light grew brighter, blinding and pure. She could feel its force pressing down on her, the weight of centuries of suffering and retribution. For a moment, she thought she would be swept away, with it lost in the rage of the earth itself. Then deep within her, something stirred. It wasn't fear, it was strength. The kind that comes only when a person has nothing left to lose. She rose slowly, one hand over her heart, the other over her unborn child. "If this is vengeance," she whispered to the wind, then take me. But if the world still deserves mercy, take my voice instead. Let me speak for both." The air shifted. The wind slowed. The massive figure paused, its form flickering like fire in water. Lightning crackled around her but did not strike. Instead, the storm bent toward her, its roar softening into something almost human. A whisper carried through the thunder. "You freed what was bound," it said, its voice deep and endless. "Now you must bind what was freed." She understood. The knife still hung from her belt, the same one she had used to cut the ropes. Her hand found it without thinking. The blade gleamed faintly in the strange light as she looked at the tall warrior. He nodded once, understanding what she was about to do. "You have given back what was taken," he said quietly. "Not let the land forget." Her heart ached as she turned the blade in her hand, pressing its tip against the scarred ground. The storm seemed to watch her, waiting. "I bind the blood," she whispered. "Not for vengeance, but for peace." The moment the words left her mouth, the ground answered. A deep rumble rolled beneath her feet, and the light around her changed from white to gold. The storm began to fade, its fury softening into a warm wind that swept across the valley like a sigh. The towering figure dissolved into mist, its voice fading with the thunder. "Balance returns," it said. "But the land remembers." The wind quieted. The rain slowed to a gentle drizzle. When she opened her eyes again, the storm was gone. The sky stretched wide and clear, painted in soft hues of pink and gold. The valley was silent, except for the sound of water dripping from the stones. The tall warrior still lay on the ground, his chest rising faintly. She knelt beside him and took his hand, her fingers trembling. "It's over," she said. "You can rest now." He smiled faintly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The land will heal. Maybe one day your child will walk it without chains." His hand went still in hers. She bowed her head and stayed there for a long time, the world quiet around her. The other warriors gathered behind her, their faces solemn. One by one, they placed their hands on the earth beside him, speaking in their language words she didn't understand but could feel in her bones. Then, without another word, they turned and walked into the fading light, their shadows merging with the land until only she remained. When the night came, she built a small fire and sat beside it, her body aching, her heart hollow. The flames flickered against the stones, and the wind whispered softly through the canyon. She thought of the past, the gallows, the soldiers, the blood that had soaked the sand, and how everything had led her here. She was alone now, but for the first time, she didn't feel abandoned. The land felt alive around her, breathing, watching, waiting. She gave birth 3 nights later under the open sky. The stars burned bright and the wind was gentle, carrying the scent of rain and sage. When the child's first cry filled the night, it echoed across the canyon like a promise. She wrapped the baby in her shawl and held it close, her heart swelling with a mix of love and fear. The storm had taken much, but it had given something back too. In the years that followed, the story of the spirit woman spread across the frontier. Some said she'd vanished into the mountains, raising her child among the spirits of the land. Others swore they'd seen her wandering the desert at dawn, her figure shimmering like heat over the sand, carrying a child with eyes that reflected the sky. The soldiers who survived Fort Ridge never spoke of what happened, but they left the northern plains and never returned. The land around the ruins grew wild again, untouched by plow or fence. Decades passed, and the world began to change. Towns rose, trains came, and people forgot the old stories. But sometimes, when the wind blew hard from the north, it carried a sound that wasn't quite thunder, a low, rolling murmur that made horses tremble and old men fall silent. The elders said it was the land remembering, whispering the name of the woman who had bound its wrath. Far from any road or town, a single tree still stood at the heart of that valley, the old cottonwood where the last fire had burned. Beneath it lay a circle of stones, worn smooth by time. Travelers sometimes found it and wondered who had built it. They said that when the wind passed through its branches, it sounded like a woman's voice humming softly to a child. And somewhere beyond that tree, in the golden haze of dusk, a figure walked the desert trail, a woman, with dark hair streaked with silver, eyes calm and steady, a child walking beside her with the same quiet strength. Those who saw them said she never looked back, never spoke, but wherever she passed. The ground grew green for a moment before returning to dust. No one knew her name, but all agreed on one thing. The vengeance of the devil from the north had ended the day she made her choice. The storm had passed, leaving peace in its wake, though the earth would never forget the blood that bought it. The land was quiet again. The rivers ran clear, the winds gentle, the plains wide and empty beneath the endless sky. Yet every now and then, when thunder rolled in the distance, the world seemed to pause and listen as if remembering the night when one woman stood against the fury of heaven and earth, and the desert learned the meaning of mercy. Her story lived on in whispers, in the rustle of dry grass, in the songs of those who still believed that the land could feel, that it could remember. And when the northern wind rose again, carrying the scent of rain across the sand, the people knew she was still out there watching, walking, guarding the balance she had given everything to restore.